Well, all right. Welcome back to Wyman King Academy history class, American history here with Mr. Fulcher live from the house. Since we're all locked down and supposedly dying or whatever. Uh, so anyway, when we last left our heroes, we were going broke really bad. We had begun the period of nationwide economic crash known as the Great Depression. Uh, you had a stock market crash October 29, followed by the World War One debt situation finally kind of catching up with us, combined with the terrible ramifications of the Smoot-Hawley tariff, combined with just a number of factors that led the entire economy to just be in the toilet for the entirety of the decade of the 1930s and even into the early part of the 1940s. The economic stimulation that came with World War II being a major part of what brought us out of it ultimately. So we talked about how Herbert Hoover, who was kind of president when the crash happened, kind of flailed around, was not able to really make any major changes. He tried to do stuff. He created a whole bunch of workfare type welfare programs similar to what Franklin Roosevelt would do, but he was a little more conservative in how much resource he was willing to put into those things. Didn't make a whole ton of difference. Honestly, you can make the case some of the stuff Roosevelt didn't make a ton of difference. Economists are really divided as to whether his economic program, known as the New Deal, what kind of impact it had. A lot of liberal economists will say, no, the New Deal, which is the series of actions that Roosevelt took in response to the Great Depression we'll talk about today, brought us out of the Great Depression. That Roosevelt came in and saved the day. And you can kind of hear, if you think about the Alabama song of the South, like you can hear echoes of that at time. Mr. Roosevelt is going to save us all. One of my favorite lines in any song ever was, somebody told us Wall Street fell, but we were so poor that we couldn't tell. That idea that Roosevelt had saved America, it kind of hung around for a long time, and a lot of people feel like that. But a lot of conservative and libertarian economists look at it and say, actually, there's reasons to believe that some of the Roosevelt's actions may have actually prolonged the Great Depression. That may have prevented markets from making certain corrections, and so that's something that economists of various persuasions will not come to agreement on necessarily. Nonetheless, whether you're a diehard New Dealer or whether you, I need to stop touching my face. Everyone keeps telling me that I can die if I touch my face, but I never realized how often I touch my face until this whole thing happened. Turns out I do it a lot. Anyway, there's where was I going? Okay, yeah, New Deal. No matter how you stand on the New Deal, clearly it changes forever the relationship between American citizen and American government. Even the most conservative, president we've had since Ronald Reagan, still talked fairly well of the New Deal. Generally supported. He wouldn't have supported probably some of the things that we'll talk about, but you don't win elections, even at the height of like the Tea Party. Or you don't win elections saying you'll get rid of Social Security, for instance. So there's really no way we'll probably ever return to a pre-New Deal conception of America and government. So if you're a critic of the expansion of government, especially federal government, over the last century, and you think this is a bad thing, well, the New Deal is a huge step off the cliff. If you're a supporter of it, then it's a huge step in progress. So whatever your opinion on that is, I certainly have a more conservative bias on that. But whatever your opinion on that is, the importance of the New Deal is almost impossible to overstate. How much our conception of even what qualifies as a left wing versus right wing policy, for instance, is still rooted a lot in the New Deal. So what is the New Deal? So Roosevelt is inaugurated in I believe he won the 1932 election, right? So he would be inaugurated in 33, and he immediately launches into a flurry of activity in his first 100 days in office. And you'll notice anytime it's inauguration time, especially for a first-term president, you'll hear a lot of rhetoric about his 100-day plan, or what can you do in your first 100 days. And the reason for that dates back to FDR. FDR had a overwhelming mandate. The Democrats slaughtered in the election. They won a commanding majority of both houses of Congress, as well as the White House, and the vast majority of the governorships. By the time they're trying to recruit a challenger to FDR in 36, there's only 7 Republican governors in all 48 states at the time. They didn't have Alaska and Hawaii yet. Roosevelt could pretty much do what he wanted as long as he didn't offend the moderates inside of his own party too much. And so he goes to work and he gets some stuff done, and he launches this. He comes into office with this famous inauguration speech where he says, "We have nothing to fear but fear itself," which is one of the most famous presidential quotations of all time. The first thing he does is he has to address this banking crisis that kind of happened in between his election and his inauguration, where we've got to figure out what to do with the fact that so many banks were closing down. People were making what they call runs on the banks, where everyone was trying to get their money out in time. A lot of them were closing. Ultimately, Roosevelt calls for what they call a bank holiday, which basically suspends banking activity until everyone can chill out. And then banks that were considered to be of a certain level of economic soundness were allowed to reopen. And this winds up doing a lot to stem the panic. Now, about 5% of banks in America closed, and when the bank closed, a lot of those people were just left high and dry. Life savings just gone, and that's one of the great tragedies of the Depression. It's one of the really difficult things about that time period for a lot of people. The vast majority of banks recovered and were able to continue on. One of the best things that Roosevelt did in the New Deal was the establishment of what they called the FDIC, Federal Deposit Insurance. Ultimately, what that is they guarantee a certain amount of the money that's in the bank, that if the bank goes belly up, you can get a certain amount out. The government will kind of back that up in the event of bank failure. And that did a lot to restore confidence in the banking system, which is important because you say, why does it matter if people have money in the banks? Well, typically where people get investments to make large capital purchases, such as what you need if you're starting a business, you typically are going to have to get a loan from a bank at some point. So if everyone was just hoarding their money in cash, it would be difficult to find a financier. And so the presence of banks is important for getting new investments off the ground, new companies started. And if you can't start new stores, new companies, new businesses, new service industry, if you can't start those things, you can't hire anyone. And so it's impossible to get, if the banking system collapses and everyone's working on a cash basis, it would be harder to kind of keep employment up and investment up, because at some point someone starting a business is going to need to have a large amount of capital that they can borrow at once. And that's easiest to do if you have a banking system where many customers have let the bank have access to their money for investment. So that's one thing he did. Another thing is he temporarily takes the nation off of the gold standard. This becomes a permanent practice under President Richard Nixon in the 1970s. But up until now, America had this gold standard more or less, occasionally changed off of it during panics or whatever. But Roosevelt moves off of it so that he can follow inflationary policies if need be. And Roosevelt is a big supporter of the ideas of a British economist. I don't think his name was mentioned in your book, but it's a mistake that they didn't, I think. It might come up later. But there was a British economist by the name of John Maynard Keynes. And he's kind of the OG of liberal economist, and liberal in the left wing sense, not necessarily in the classically liberal sense. So John Maynard Keynes basically said, tax and spend is the way to get out of recession. Government activity is the way that you end. If the market hits a lull, just let the state start spending money. So the idea of economic stimulus packages to try to spur economic activity in a crisis, that's Keynes's bread and butter. And so Roosevelt is attracted to this idea. And he's surrounded by a group of advisors, some of them formal, some of them informal, known as the Brain Trust. There's a lot of college professors and stuff like that. It is an overstatement, I believe, to say that Roosevelt was a socialist. That would be too big of a statement. But there were people inside of his brain trust that were kind of attracted to that way of thinking. Some of them were intrigued even by some of the stuff that was happening in the Soviet Union, although again, most of Roosevelt's people would be anti-communist, but a couple of them flirted with some of the ideas. There also were a lot of people in the Brain Trust flirted with admiration for Benito Mussolini, the fascist dictator of Italy, because he had kind of a corporatist ideas about economics of why don't the government and businesses and labor kind of pool together and try to figure out the economy, kind of manage. So even though I don't think it's fair to call Roosevelt a socialist per se, he's not allergic to some of the ideas. He's definitely someone who believes in government regulation and command to a certain extent. And that's going to cause him to kind of overstep his boundaries in a couple areas. A few things he did that remain kind of broadly popular, but there's several that he's going to come up with that are going to be counterproductive or excessive. So one thing that helps Roosevelt be popular too is he learned how to exploit the new medium of radio. Radio had just come out because people didn't have a lot of money to spend on entertainment in the 1930s. There was still something of an entertainment culture because not everyone was broke. The vast majority of Americans are still able to eat. But everyone had to kind of tighten their belt. But then you did have like a quarter to third of the country at one point 24% unemployment. That's a big deal. So I don't want to downplay the Great Depression. You have to remember it doesn't necessarily mean every single person is starving though. But because people didn't spend a lot on new entertainment, the radios that they bought in the 1920s were a big deal. And Roosevelt would often have what they called fireside chats, where he would kind of address the nation via radio. And he really kind of had his voice kind of had a reassuring tone to it, and people really liked what they heard. So one day, Roosevelt starts a flurry of government programs, usually with acronyms for names. Al Smith, the former Democratic presidential candidate and former governor of New York, said that it looked like someone was trying to make anagrams with their alphabet soup, and that phrase, the alphabet soup agencies, is kind of held and referring to Roosevelt's different organizations he started. So they varied in different degrees of radicalism. So they had Roosevelt's New Deal. He had three things: relief, recovery, and reform were kind of the three planks of the New Deal, of what they were trying to accomplish. One organization he started was the Civilian Conservation Corps, which would put young men at work in reforestation and things like that, as an attempt to kind of create government jobs that could also be helpful in some other things. He started something called the Public Works Administration. They would work on courthouses, government buildings, work on roads, things like that. Probably the biggest of his jobs programs was something called the Works Progress Administration, or the WPA. And they were created in 1935. Even with these first few jobs programs, you still had a lot of people that needed the dole, or just basically handout. And then, one thing about it is, even though America starts moving towards the invention of the welfare state with the New Deal, there's still this idea that people ought to have to work for it. There's still a high value put on keeping someone at work. And so the Works Progress Administration greatly increased these sorts of government jobs. A lot of people accuse them of kind of being make-work jobs, where you didn't necessarily need to do all of the things they were doing. And some people say that these kind of work programs can be counterproductive because every dollar that's spent by the government came from somebody's tax dollars, right? And so you're taking tax money out of the economy and then putting it back. So people can dispute about how much it works, but obviously the people that got a job there were grateful to have the job. Ultimately, the WPA wound up costing them $5 billion, which that's an astronomical sum in the 1930s. But still, even with all that money spent, was not really able to deal with the widespread unemployment. One of the more radical figures in the Roosevelt administration is a guy by the name of Henry Wallace. And Henry Wallace he's not Roosevelt's first vice president, but he later becomes vice president later on, and misses being president by this much, because Roosevelt comes to distrust him. He has him replaced on the ticket by Harry Truman, who turns out to ultimately be his successor, and Truman winds up being a pretty good president. But Wallace, though, missed it by this much. After being left off the ticket, he ran as a third-party candidate for president, representing a socialist party that was openly sympathetic to the Soviet Union. And Henry Wallace, by the later part of his life, had pretty much gone nearly full-blown communist. And there's even some evidence that he may have been, connected to some Soviet espionage rings, may have, been in contact with him. So he was a very, very radical left figure. He was put in charge of something called the Agricultural Adjustment Agency, AAA, and they were involved in trying to regulate the price of American agricultural products to reach a certain level for the sake of benefiting American agriculture. And they created the standard for, to this day, we still have agricultural subsidies in America where government will pay farmers to make or not make certain crops in order to keep the prices artificially high for instance, something like corn or something like that, so that the market doesn't crater and take all of our farms out with it. Because obviously the foundation of an economy is always the agriculture. Even if it's not an agricultural economy per se, people have to have food. So you need to have that sector, even if only 1% of the country is working in it, it has to be cranking out productivity. And so we still do subsidies and stuff like that to try to keep them afloat. Of course, there's reasons to criticize that as well. But this really gets started with Henry Wallace and the AAA. And they do a lot to kind of regulate prices and so on. And of course, I mean, the odd thing, though, is they are, for the sake of trying to benefit the farmers, they're intentionally making food prices higher while you've got, 1 out of 4 people, or, whatever the numbers are at a given time. I mean, you've got a substantial percentage of Americans are starving. There's literally reports of, many people literally starving to death during this period of time. And yet we're kind of artificially inflating prices, and so that was kind of a questionable practice to a lot of people. But obviously it worked well for certain ones. The most radical thing that Roosevelt does is something called the National Industrial Recovery Act, which created something called the National Recovery Administration, or the NRA. No relation to the gun NRA. So this NRA was an attempt to basically standardize prices, wages, and stuff like that in various industries across the country. And it was the closest America's ever come to what we would consider central planning of the economy, at least during peacetime. Obviously you had Woodrow Wilson, more socialism back during World War I. But to end peacetime, they're setting wage and price ceilings and floors, meaning like you can't charge more than a certain thing or less than a certain thing. And they couldn't make it like completely illegal to violate it because there wasn't the constitutional authority to do that. But what they would do is if your business was in agreement with these standards, they would put a blue eagle up in your shop window, and it would show that you were cooperating with the NIRA. And the problem was, if you didn't have a blue eagle, a lot of businesses that didn't cooperate were openly persecuted. People would smash the windows or different things if they were diehard New Dealers or whatever. And some of the things were ridiculous. So I'm going to quote from your textbook just for a second here. This is Bob Jones University Press. United States history curriculum. So just some unusual code provisions so there are 540 specific codes, all of which tended to raise prices and wages, reduce hours, and remove competition and innovation. Central planning tends to remove competition. When you remove competition, you tend to have less innovative products. So some of the things that were included in the code: lumber companies were required to keep a list of all their customers' names. Investment securities analysts were fined for sending letters to clients without their prior permission. Jewelers couldn't advertise their watch repair prices. Their dry cleaners who operated in low traffic areas couldn't charge lower prices to compete with dry cleaners in higher traffic areas. Businesses couldn't offer discounts to customers. So there's a whole bunch of policies that made their way into the NIRA and enforced by the NRA that were ridiculous and counterproductive. It's a lot of regulation. It tended to limit people's ability to kind of come up with creative ideas to compete in the marketplace. And ultimately, both the AAA and the NRA are going to be thrown out of existence by the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court is going to say, we didn't have the right to do this. The Congress doesn't have the authority to set wage and price controls. That's not what the purpose of the Constitution was. So, we mentioned already FDIC. One other very important, part of the New Deal was the invention of what they call the Tennessee Valley Authority, or the TVA. Once again, mentioned in Song of the South by Alabama. Papa got a job with the TVA, bought a washing machine and a Chevrolet. So the Tennessee Valley Authority was created. At this point in time, electricity had kind of come to the vast majority of the North, but it really had not come to a lot of parts of the rural South. There were substantial parts of the states of Tennessee, Alabama, Mississippi that still did not have electricity. And so the Tennessee Valley Authority, they started to manage dams and stuff like that. But they also connected with that. One very important thing they did was help bring electricity to the southern states. And so a lot of the kind of impoverished parts of the Deep South that had not yet had really the market for establishing electricity, because remember, you can't just create an electric line out of nowhere. You got to have, you got to put up poles and wires. I mean, it's an ornate thing. Ultimately, the TVA is going to be responsible for kind of completing a lot of the electricitization. Is that a word? I'll make it up if it's not. Of electrification. There we go. That's what I'm looking for. Of much of the rural South. Probably the most lasting and important part of the New Deal was the establishment of the Social Security system. So, every week when I get my paycheck, I have a certain percentage that they call the payroll taxes taken out that is withdrawn from my check, and then my the school or whoever my employer would be has to pay that same payroll tax, and these payroll taxes are used to fund a pool of money they call Social Security that pays out benefits to retirees, people above a certain age, and then also sometimes if people are orphaned, they can get Social Security earlier in life. If they're disabled, they can get Social Security earlier in life. But basically, people that it would be, the idea was people who are infirmed, people who are, maybe they've lost all their money in the banking system or whatever, but they can't really go back to work because they're too old to work, and their kids can't necessarily take care of them because they're underemployed as well, and they've got 12 children because that's how many people had back then. Why don't we create the system where the elderly can be taken care of with this money? Now, what happens is Social Security is sold to America like, you pay in and then you get it back when you retire. The reality is that's not how it works. You're paying for the people while you're young who are retired then, and then your children are going to pay for yours. Now it is going to be. It's going to be altered depending on how much you put in. That is a part of the regulations. But people kind of have this idea like, oh, I've got this Social Security account that's based on my contribution. The problem is they created the whole Social Security thing. It's really structured like a pyramid scheme, to be honest. The idea was, hey, everyone has 6, 7, 8 children. So population is going to continue to grow exponentially. They can take care of the old people we have now, and then there'll be more young people later to take care of them later. Well, what happens is people stop having so many kids. Nowadays most families have 2 kids. Which is if a married couple only has 2 children, they have only replaced themselves. They have not grown the population at all. What's happened now is, if I were you, I wouldn't bank on having Social Security when you get old, because there's really just not enough people to pay into it to keep it going forever. So that's something we're going to have to deal with in our moment in history ultimately. But in the short run, it was a very popular program. Remains a popular program. It's untouchable politically. People have had ideas about how to try to fix this coming Social Security crisis that people have coming, and everyone who's proposed any idea to make any changes at all to kind of deal with it loses every election. Because people just don't want to let their Social Security be messed with under any circumstances. So it's pretty much permanent part of the American political structure, even though, at some point the math isn't going to work. I don't know. We'll see what happens. One of the only real areas of pushback that Roosevelt got on the New Deal was from the Supreme Court. And the reason for that was that the Supreme Court, during much of Roosevelt's first term, was kind of divided on a 5-4 basis with like 4 people that generally, I guess you might call them more liberal justices, that were generally okay with the New Deal. You had 4 that were called the 4 Horsemen of Reaction, because they were more arch-conservative in a very laissez-faire economic sense. And then Charles Evan Hughes, the Chief Justice, who would later on become a presidential candidate at one point in his life. Charles Evan Hughes was actually kind of a moderate. He was kind of the swing vote, and really whoever in a given case could get Hughes on their side would oftentimes win. So the Supreme Court winds up striking down the AAA, winds up striking down the NRA, and that's going to lead to the most controversial thing that Roosevelt did on domestic policy at the time, which was the court packing plan. There was some criticism. Obviously, a lot of the Republicans at the time, the idea of Democrats are liberal, Republicans are conservative was not really the case yet. Not until the 1970s did the party start to break on purely ideological lines. But there was a lot of pushback against the New Deal among the Republicans. That's comes to be, considered the more conservative position. And then you also have there were also some moderate Democrats as well that weren't down with some of the furthest out stuff Roosevelt proposed. He also takes some criticism from his left wing as well, though. Probably his most famous left-wing critic is Huey Long, the governor of Louisiana, who's kind of an interesting character. He basically runs the state of Louisiana like a dictator. Rules it for years. Using bribery and all kinds of tactics to ensure that he controls the state like Saddam Hussein would have controlled Iraq. It was absolutely insane that it was able to happen. But he's famously a left-wing critic. There's a Catholic radio preacher named Father Charles Coughlin who winds up criticizing Roosevelt from the left, basically saying that he was a huge supporter of the New Deal at the beginning, called it Christ Deal at one point, and then decided that he wasn't going far enough in a redistribution of income way, wanted to be in a more socialist direction than Roosevelt was going, started turning on Roosevelt with great gusto. He actually winds up becoming a fascist sympathizer later on. So there were critics both on the left and right of Roosevelt, but he was very popular nationwide. And so really the only kickback was from the politically unaccountable Supreme Court. And so the way that Roosevelt decides to deal with this issue is to pack the court. He says, why? Because constitutionally you don't have to have 9 justices. It's whatever law Congress wants to pass as to how many people. So he says, why don't we, create rules that would enable him to expand the size of the Supreme Court and then fill it with new justices who were going to basically rubber stamp the New Deal. So Roosevelt here is saying, he doesn't really care about whether these programs are constitutional or not. He thinks they're going to be for the good of the country in his mind, and so he wants judges that are going to let him do what he wants to do. So ultimately, the court packing plan is highly unpopular. It's the biggest political crisis that Roosevelt faces in terms of blowback. Even a lot of New Deal people didn't think it was right to basically try to rig the Supreme Court. Ultimately, what winds up happening is one of the conservative justices dies, enabling Roosevelt to replace him, and then you have Hughes starts to lean a little bit more to the left after a period of having leaned a little more to the right. And so ultimately, that is going to, the phrase they used at the time was a switch in time saves nine, meaning the nine justice Supreme Court was kind of rescued by the switch in a couple of justices. And so after that switch happens, though, the New Deal kind of goes on unchecked because Roosevelt kind of gets what he wants for the most part from that point on. 1936 comes time for Roosevelt to run for re-election. The Republicans are hard-pressed to find a popular challenger. I mean, because the Democrats so devastated them in the 32 election that they have not started to recover. They only have 7 governors to pick from if they want to go with a governor. They wound up picking a governor of Kansas by the name of Alf Landon. Alf Landon gets his butt whooped in the 1936 election. Roosevelt is reelected overwhelmingly. Landon only wins a couple of states. Roosevelt wins nearly, it's this close to a shutout. 8 electoral votes for Alf Landon. He won 2 states, Maine and Vermont. Franklin Roosevelt won the remaining 523 electoral votes at the time. The Republicans really only got a few seats in each house of Congress. It looked like a possibility of the two-party system shutting down because there was so much Democratic dominance during the 1930s. Which made internal conflicts within the Democratic Party much more important on certain policy positions, especially as it relates to segregation policy and stuff like that, because people weren't really concerned about the Republican thing, but they did want to keep the Democrats, together. So as far as how people are responding to the Depression, you do have this flood of people that they called hobos who would, kind of jump on tracks and ride from town to town trying to hunt for work or for food. You do have, there were 20%, according to the New York City Health Department in 1932, 20% of the city's public school children were malnourished. Unemployment was at 20% as late as 1939. So again, all the New Deal stuff, the WPA and the CCC and the TVA, didn't really do all that much to get rid of unemployment. We're still 10 years after Black Tuesday. We've still got 1 in 5 people, not having work, which is better than 1 in 4, but it's still not good. Lots of private charities establishing what they would call bread lines, along as people on city streets would wait for food. Soup kitchens started to open up across the country. A lot of people did finally have to go get, some government relief in certain programs like the Federal Emergency Relief, FERA. Those were not big checks. I mean, you couldn't feed a family off of them by any means. There was a lot of homelessness, despite the fact that rent was $10, $12 a month. In a lot of parts of the country at the time. Now that translates to, that translates to 300 or 400 today, I think, something like that. But which is crazy to think about how much inflation we've had. But even that was not really enough to kind of stop unemployment and homelessness from and all these things were big issues. Obviously, if it's bad enough for Americans in general, it's really bad for minorities. So, because in addition to the general economic malaise, you also have special things as a result of racial discrimination that made it very difficult for African American and Hispanic Americans to, and I presume Asians as well, to endure certain things during this time. So, one thing that happens is that the sharecropper system in the South kind of falls to pieces. And so you have a lot of Black Americans start trying to move to northern cities, trying to find work. This started really with World War I. It picks up really at the end of World War II, what they call the Great Migration. But it kind of continues throughout the 30s. But they find out getting to these northern cities is not exactly paradise either, because it's not good anywhere. One thing, though, that does happen, Roosevelt is one of the first presidents in a while, because, Wilson was a diehard segregationist, and, Roosevelt, was pretty racist, too. The Theodore was. It's the first, FDR is the first president in a little while with sympathy towards the burgeoning civil rights movement. He takes baby steps because he doesn't want to offend a lot of the Southern Democrats, because a lot of the Southern Democrats were very important to his New Deal programs. It's a little bit of a myth that it was all the conservative Democrats. Some of the most diehard segregationists were diehard New Dealers. Love things like the TVA and the AAA and all these things. So it was not just some people tell the simplistic story where, it was conservative Democrats opposed integration. It wasn't just the conservative wing of the Democratic Party. But Roosevelt didn't want to move too fast in that direction because of political considerations. But Eleanor Roosevelt, the First Lady in particular, met with a lot of African American leaders. They made a point of ending segregation in the WPA and a couple other New Deal programs. So we start to have some baby steps towards civil rights. Just when it seems like things can't get any worse for the economy, though, there is a major agricultural problem hits the Midwest and the Great Plains. Especially the state of Oklahoma, and that is known as the Dust Bowl. And so the Dust Bowl, the Great Plains had been this area that people had worked really hard to kind of make it decent farmland. It was naturally kind of tough prairie sod. They'd managed to convert lots of it over into decent farmland. But in the 1920s, starting around 1932, there was a really bad drought came. And then there gets to be this weather pattern that would cause these horrendous twisters that were tearing up a lot of this dirt and just sending this dust just spiraling everywhere. So in addition to the famine that caused the ground to get dusty and useless, which was bad for the crops and it's hard to raise crops, on top of that, it's kind of spinning all this stuff around, you'd wind up, dust was going through a lot of people had wooden houses that had holes, like slats in between the logs and stuff, and dust would start coming in through those things. It would wind up, when the storm was over, with a big heap of dust at the edge of a fence or in front of a door, all these different places. Sometimes you could nearly suffocate in these twisters. There would be so much dust stirred up that people would literally almost suffocate. Some people would sleep with a mask. They would obscure sunlight. This is like the last thing you needed. You can't make a living in the manufacturing sector because they're laying everybody off because no one can afford to buy what they're selling. You can't make a living in agriculture either because, if you're in these states, because of the Dust Bowl circumstance. And it hit as far north as places like Colorado, but it really hammered, in particular, the state of Oklahoma. The state of Oklahoma, a lot of people who became known as the Okies, maybe if any of you like old school country music, you might remember Merle Haggard talking about proud to be an Okie from Muskogee, right? The Okies were these people that often would touch my face again, I gotta stop. Who often would travel to California or places like that trying to hunt for work because they just couldn't make it in Oklahoma anymore. So a lot of people abandoned that region altogether, although eventually it's able to recover. But it was rough times in the 1930s. And a lot of people respond to the rough times by turning to lives of crime. And what's weird is, and this is a similar parallel to what we talked about with back in the Wild West, is that a lot of these people kind of became heroes. Men like John Dillinger or Bonnie and Clyde, the famous couple that went on a robbery spree. Machine Gun, Babyface Nelson, all these guys sporting Tommy guns and all this stuff, and robbing banks. And a lot of these guys actually become heroes because they kind of like seeing these rich guys get their stuff taken because, there's obviously a portion of America that, that blames the rich people for causing this thing. And so, and a lot of times these guys you start to have the conception of public enemy number one and so on. And a lot of this is connected to the newly established Federal Bureau of Investigation, or FBI, which is headed by a guy named J. Edgar Hoover. It's going to be more important as time goes on. Eventually, Hoover is kind of starting to be treated as an American hero, leading the FBI into chasing, and the so-called G-men, that's what they used to call the agents, chasing all these outlaws down. Eventually, though, Hoover is going to be a very discredited person because we come to find out, later on that he was using the FBI to spy on basically every influential person in Washington and a lot of influential leaders, and basically blackmailed all of Washington into letting him maintain his career at risk of exposing every dark secret they ever had. Hoover was a major opponent of the civil rights movement, winds up harassing Martin Luther King and several others and trying to blackmail them into stopping the civil rights movement and so on. So J. Edgar Hoover winds up being kind of a jerk, to say the least, but it first kind of comes to prominence in the 1930s in response to all this crime wave that kind of hits as people get increasingly desperate. So anyway, so that's more or less the Great Depression for you. I'll be back in a little bit when we start to talk about the road to World War II. But of course, first I'll give you all a little bit of time to work on your research paper. And again, if you got questions about the research paper, what I want from it, and expectations, anything like that, don't be afraid to send me an email. I hope you enjoyed the video, and have yourselves a good day.